So today we have Lucas Vogelsang, CEO and co-founder at Centrifuge. We have Dan Reeser, Chief Growth Officer at Acala. We have Kenny, co-founder and COO of Manta Network. And we have Alexei, founder of Interlay. And this fantastic panel will be moderated by the one and only Sean Tabrizi, who's a runtime engineering lead at Parity, the runtime engineering lead at Parity. Thank you so much for joining us, folks.
Thanks for having us here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Sean.
Yeah, so I'll be moderating this. I have some questions prepared, but of course, I would love us to take the conversation wherever we want to take it. I think I'll start with just a small intro, just what is XCMP and XCM, just to kind of set the playing field for people who may not be familiar with these technologies. Polkadot kind of has like three major cells. That is scalability, shared security, and interoperability. And what we're talking about today is a lot about interoperability, how these different chains on Polkadot can communicate and talk with one another. XCMP is a protocol built on top of Polkadot, which allows arbitrary messages to be sent between different chains, parachains, and allowing communication. And then XCM, which is a term that maybe all of you are much more familiar with, is a language for what kind of messages to send. So in combination, XCMP and XCM allow different chains and parachains to communicate and work with one another, and to basically, really extend functionality to the next level of like Web3, having these different chains really talk to each other and work with one another. So that's the high-level overview, what we'll be talking about. To start with, I guess I want to go to each of the different people in the panel here and maybe talk briefly about what your team is building and whether or not interoperability in XCM was a major factor in deciding Polkadot as the platform to build on, and why it matters for your chain. So maybe why don't we start with Lucas? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry. Yeah. Hey, welcome everyone. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Centrifuge. So maybe just super briefly, what we do is we allow real-world borrowers and real-world lenders to use DeFi to access liquidity or to lend, right? So for example, I want to buy a house. I can actually go to a lender that uses DeFi in the background to actually lend money to me so that I can buy the house, renovate it, whatever. On the other side, if I actually am a crypto power user, I have some stable coins that want to invest in stable assets. I can do that by investing in, for example, real estate, right, or trade finance. We're doing all that using this all these DeFi rails and DeFi ecosystem, because that's ultimately where I think the financial system of the future will be built. And so for us, when we think about XCM and kind of composability in general, right, the magic of DeFi is that you are not building the entire thing yourself. You're actually relying on others to provide functionality, right? As a user, if I have a token today, I have the opportunity to swap on several different dexes, not sexes, decentralized exchanges, right? I can go to different models, and whichever one suits my needs best, I can use. And this all relies on the fact that all of this stuff is compatible with each other. And so I think from that perspective, the challenge today actually is that a lot of this stuff only works on Ethereum within the same EVM, because once you have bridging, you have to bridge assets. You have to think of you get all this as asynchronicity. You have trust issues around the security of the assets and so on, which you don't necessarily have with XCM. And so I think what really is exciting for us with where we want to use XCM is to actually allow these issuers that want to originate real access to liquidity that is in Acala, right? Put it up as collateral there, or go and actually use it as collateral in Interlay, or borrow against Bitcoin, right? Or use get privacy and actually shield their transactions, right? And so those are all use cases where if you just have a parachain and you're trying to do everything by yourself on that parachain, you're actually not going to get very far, right? You're not going to benefit from the whole ecosystem. And that's where XCM for us comes in. Yeah.
Awesome. How about you, Dan?
Yep. So Acala is building a kind of DeFi optimized parachain on Polkadot. Originally, the four co-founders were actually building a synthetic asset protocol on Ethereum and started to experience kind of the limitations of Ethereum mainnet. So started evaluating Cosmos, what would be ETH2, and then Polkadot. And back then decided to go with Polkadot for a few main reasons that Sean, you already mentioned. So shared security. As a developer team who likes building products, we didn't want to have to focus on building up a whole validator set to secure our chain. So that was one thing that Polkadot offered us out of the box. If you've been tracking these parachain auctions over time, the cost of winning one of these slots has significantly decreased over time. So this notion of Polkadot is expensive to launch on is actually not true at all anymore. And in our opinion, the benefits you get on the community side, just these compounding effects that you get from building on Polkadot is very much worth it. The second thing is Substrate, which is Polkadot's SDK. That allowed us to customize at a very deep level. And everyone on this call right now is running a different parachain that is very different from one another. Some chains like Moonbeam are focusing on EVM compatibility for dApps. Others, like maybe Centrifuge, are focusing on a specific application or a specific use case, which you could call an app chain. And Akala, in our case, we focused on DeFi and built our own products like our stablecoin, our DEX, liquid staking product into our chain, which was enabled by Substrate. And then the third thing would be interoperability, which everyone's already mentioned. So as a stablecoin, for example, we built AUSD with Substrate so that it could be trustlessly transferred to other parachains in the ecosystem. This is only useful if you can work with other parachains trustlessly without centralized bridges, etc. So the interoperability aspect of Polkadot was really important to us. So that's it for Akala. I know we've got more to go through, so I'll hand it off to maybe Kenny.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Really appreciate it. Calling in from very sunny California. And so my name is Kenny, and I'm one of the co-founders of Manta Network. And we specifically are trying to enable privacy for the entire Polkadot and Kusama ecosystem using zero-knowledge proofs. And I could probably go into a little more detail about what that means later. But essentially, you can think of it as, privacy as a utility for the Polkadot and Kusama ecosystems. And we chose Polkadot initially because it made a lot of sense from the utility that we're trying to provide, right? We're not a application specific use case, right? We're not building a specific DeFi product or a specific product in general. We are building a utility that we believe should be available for all sorts of Web3 applications, all sorts of networks. And so initially when we set out, we decided, okay, we need to be that layer one so that we can offer that sort of privacy availability to everyone else. And Polkadot was a natural choice because of the interoperability, because otherwise, right, if you build a layer one on your own, you're kind of siloed there. And so it makes sense for, if you're building a layer one and you want to build an ecosystem on top of your layer one, right? So if you're thinking about like a virtual machine ecosystem, whether it's EVM compatible or something else, right? Like that could be its own standalone. But as Manta Network, right, we are focusing specifically on the zero knowledge proof systems. And so our whole value is to be able to bring that zero knowledge proof system over to other chains, other projects. And so that interoperability plays a critical role in how we decided to go towards Polkadot. And last but not least, Alexei.
Cool. So thanks. So hi, I'm Alexei. I'm one of the two co-founders of Intellay. I mean, a lot has been already said about XCM and how everybody uses it. When we started Intellay, our mission was to connect the chasm that you have, like bridge the chasm between Bitcoin, which is leading adoption globally with over 300 million users and penetrating every single sector we know today, and the technical and product innovation that you have on Ethereum, Polkadot, and all these newer chains, right? And they were disconnected so far and only connected by centralized providers. And we just saw the last 3 days why this is risky again. So what Intellay does is it allows you to use Bitcoin on Polkadot, right? And this in itself is already kind of the first pitch for XCM, because it means that we as an Intellay chain can customize to be optimized for Bitcoin, reuse their cryptographic libraries, right? Really make sure that our system works very well with the BTC network, but at the same time, make it available to the entire Polkadot network and then beyond. And one of the biggest factors for our decision to build on Polkadot was that even in the first white paper, the vision was, okay, Polkadot will be connected to all other chains. And for us, that was one of the most important factors. We don't only want to have it on a single chain, right? If you have it on Interlay, that's great. Better if you can have it within the entire Polkadot ecosystem. So, I mean, Lucas, Dan, and Kenny have listed all these cool use cases, so I'll not repeat them. But I mean, you can use Bitcoin everywhere on every parachain. But then the next step is also, well, use the same setup, use these trustless bridges that are currently being developed on Polkadot to then connect to Ethereum, Cosmos, Solana, and all these other ecosystems, because we firmly believe that maximalism doesn't really work well. And in the end, people should not care, right? We're building infrastructure. In 3 to 4 years, hopefully sooner, people will not care about the infrastructure. They will care about the applications. And they should not notice on which chain they are. And then every single dApp and builder can just decide what framework makes most sense for them. If you want to build something very simple that, is very versatile, but doesn't go into too much detail in terms of specific optimizations, you're good as a dApp. But if you're building a very big thing, very specialized, then a parachain is very useful because you can customize. And that's what I think all of the 4 projects that are live here have done. So yeah, that's interesting.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think this goes to show that we have such a diverse panel here of people building on Polkadot, but all using XCM, which is a much stronger primitive for Web3, right, in general. So now I want to go into a little more concrete stuff. So you're welcome to touch on any or all the topics that I mentioned here, but I like to go around and talk about one thing you all have built that's working on XCM, that's being used today, something that you might be working on, some kind of future idea. And maybe something maybe something that you would like to see, but your team isn't building. Not every team can build everything, but what are the kinds of things you might want to see across the aisle, or might be a good thing in XCM for even other people on this panel? So maybe let's go backwards now. Start with Alexi, and we can go back around.
Cool. All right. So what we've built so far is a fully decentralized and trustless rapid conversion. We call it vaulted to differentiate ourselves. And you can use this on the 4 major parachains already. So Parallel, Akala, Moonbeam, and now also A-Star, and there's more in the making. So that already works. And something that we've also done, which I think is quite interesting, is that the Interlay treasury, right, the network itself has deployed incentives and deployed capital into AMMs and protocols on other chains, right? So that instead of using some foundation and then having this intermediary in between, what we can do is you can have the community decide what to do, how to use the treasury, and then actively manage it. And through an automated vote, deploy capital on another chain, and that works. And that's actually really cool. Something that we would really love to see are more bots in the sense of that can do arbitrage and a better API. So we can trace things that happen across different parachains better, and that you have a nice API, nice interface that you can easily tap into. There's a lot of stuff going on with Polkaholic, Subscan, and so on. But I think this is the next big win, because then you actually get a lot of analytics companies and traders, and also people who just want to leverage even off-chain the different functionalities. And if they have a nice way of doing that without having to figure out the intrinsics of every single parachain, that would be brilliant. And I mean, this is not something that we're building. So I think this is kind of a call for action. I think that this is there's an easy win to make here.
Cool. Kenny?
Yeah, so just to preface all this, right? So Manta Network, our parachain isn't currently live. So we do have testnet, our Dolphin testnet. And so some of the things that we have implemented, some of it is on the Kusama level, Calamari, and some of it is on the testnet level on Rococo. And so on Calamari, specifically opening up HRMP channels with other parachains and transferring assets, right? Those are enabled. And we see that sort of liquidity with KMA tokens going over to Moonbeam and their dexes as well. But then on the testnet side, right, we do have those testnet channels open also. And those testnet channels allow for other parachains to bring their assets into our Dolphin testnet for now and privatize those assets. And so you can do private payments with other parachain assets through the testnet, which we hope to enable through the parachain pretty soon. So those are some of the things that we've worked on. Some of the things that we want to work on, and some of the things that we're currently researching. This is something that we're we're kind of exploring with Moonbeam as well as ZK Validator, right, is building private applications through Moonbeam's decentralized application ecosystem. And so it's still something that's in sort of the research phase, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in December. But ideally, right, like we want to streamline the user experience a little bit more, such that users would be able to call certain private functions through the smart contract layer without having to think too much about the steps to interact through like XCM. Yeah.
How about you, Dan?
Yep. So I'll just talk about one, I guess, very specific use case that's uses XCM a surprising amount now that I mapped it out. So AUSD, like I mentioned, is our stablecoin that was built in Substrate, and AUSD operates similar to DAI, if you're familiar, where you need to basically deposit some sort of collateral, and then you can mint a stablecoin after that collateral is deposited. So let's go through one example of getting from AUSD on Akala to minting AUSD and then transferring that over to Moonbeam onto Stella, and what exactly that looks like. So let's say you want to use DOT as your collateral to mint AUSD, but you want to use staking first on Akala through LDOT. So you would send your DOT from the relay chain to Akala using XCM, and then that DOT would land on Akala. And then you can stake your DOT for LDOT and hold this LDOT token that's kind of interest bearing, and you want to use your LDOT as collateral to mint AUSD. So when you stake your DOT for LDOT, what's actually happening is the DOT that you staked is actually flowing back through XCM to the relay chain and being staked on the relay chain to help secure Polkadot. So there's another XCM transaction. Then you're holding LDOT and you mint AUSD, and then you can bridge your AUSD over to Moonbeam using XCM. And then that AUSD is, I think it's actually called XCAUSD on Moonbeam. And then that AUSD can be used to, for example, provide liquidity to the Glimmer AUSD pair on Stella Swap on Moonbeam. So I think that's maybe 3 or 4 different XCM transactions, all for that one specific use case, but really cool when you think about what's all going on in the background there. One functionality or just feature I think that would be cool to see in the ecosystem. I'm not sure if this is more of this might be more of a parity thing, but we've discussed this with various people. But around the Polkadot treasury, one thing that would be cool is if it could become a little bit more multi-chain friendly in terms of the assets that the treasury can hold. So right now the treasury is holding DOT, but in the future, if it could hold like parachain tokens, maybe Bitcoin from Interlay, stable coins like AUSD, to be able to, for example, issue treasury grants using other tokens other than DOT, and to be able to hold other tokens, including LP tokens. So if the treasury wanted to provide liquidity to some sort of a DeFi protocol in the ecosystem, that produces an LP token that could actually go back and be held by the treasury. So things like this would be kind of on the wish list for us in terms of new functionality. Of course, there's XCM involved in that. This is also kind of like a product level wish list item, but just one idea there. And I'll pass it over to Lucas now.
I mean, looking at where, and maybe Sean, you actually are much better to fill in on that, but XCM is still super early stage, so I don't want to like. I think I guess a lot of stuff that I'm going to be addressing, I think it's just a fact of like maturing the ecosystem. But I believe the biggest challenge for like XCM adoption is not like lack of functionality at the like protocol level, but much more like a developer experience and user experience issue. For example, when you actually send stuff from chain A to chain B, like most portfolio trackers, most block explorers, like wallets, right? Like they're completely lost. Like you do some transaction, your tokens are gone. Like now, like they appear on a different chain, but you actually need to, for you, like as a user, I don't want to think about, actually, I believe that users won't actually care which chain it's on. It's not just that they don't care what the underlying technology is or what chains are. I think this was something that you said, Dan, just in your intro, right? But I think ultimately, like as a user, I just have my wallet and I have tokens in there. I use them with different dApps. and everything else is not something I want to worry about. So I think that's really the place where, like, to drive the adoption of XCM, we're going to have to do the most work. So things like, if I want to buy something for $100 on Akala, I want to buy some tokens, but I actually have $100 in Manta, then like my wallet should be able to just like move it over, right? Or like show me, oh, like you can pick from this and this balance and just like use XCM to transfer it over. Like today, the user experience is a lot of times, oh, like here's my wallet on this chain, here's my wallet on that chain, and they're like not really connected. I think for developers, like there's still a lot of stuff we need to do to actually secure it, so that you can much more easily open XCM channels with other chains and like not be too worried about like potential like attack vectors, whether that's like spamming or like authentication issues when you don't know where transactions are coming from. That will make it easier to just open a channel with anyone. Like fundamentally, I believe like you shouldn't have to actively open a channel. I think you should just be able to decide whether you accept messages or not, and the default should be, yeah, I accept them, right? Because ultimately, like if you kind of draw an analogy to Ethereum, a token on Ethereum, like most of the times it doesn't have any block list for like any other dApp, right, that you want to use it with. No, like it's the opposite. Like you want it to be transferred wherever you need to. And I think those are the kind of things we need to build to get this really usable, and also explain it to users. Because yeah, like imagine from a technical level, it's like having 20 bank accounts, right? Like I use 20 parachains, so I have 20 bank accounts with like possibly like many different currencies. It's not even a bank account. Maybe it's more like a stock portfolio. So like I have a brokerage. I'm with Charles Schwab. I'm with Interactive Brokers. I'm with Robinhood, and I need to like juggle all these, right? And so there really just needs to be like one unified experience, and that will be, I think, the place where we have to make the best job at making it easy for users.
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. I think that's a really good point. I'd like to touch on that a little bit. I think, one of the interests, like, from my perspective, from the parity side and doing like, kind of the low-level development of these things, I think we look at building all of the key building blocks that allow people to build larger applications. But oftentimes, building these complex technologies, we try to maximize flexibility, which sometimes comes at a cost of complexity. I think you touched on that. Like building some of these things is hard to do. And I mean, Dan, you even mentioned your scenario here, which has lots of different XCM workings. I think from my perspective, even if you look at like platforms like Ethereum, at the EVM level, actually everything is assembly, right? But then there were languages built on top of it. There's like a Python version. There's a Solidity version, obviously, that kind of stuff, which takes and exposes that assembly into like a simpler language. I think that what we're missing in the ecosystem with XCM right now is we're basically expecting people to work with these like low-level building blocks, when really there's much more meta languages and meta protocols which can be developed on top of that. So I think this is something that we will see more of in the future, and will probably help and reduce the complexity to getting into XCM. But yeah, definitely this is like my call to action to the ecosystem. If you're good at the higher level language development, I think XCM has all the building blocks necessary to actually build much more easy to use programming for being able to connect and talk to other chains. So actually, no, that's perfect. I want to touch actually next into development, and maybe we can start with Dan, because you kind of mentioned a pretty complex scenario here. What does development look like right now in terms of Substrate and Polkadot when building an XCM? Has your team built any specific tooling, or has any specific ways that they verify these scenarios are working? And like what kind of other tooling might you want to see in the ecosystem? Like what kinds of things, either parity or community, would you like to see to help improve the problems or difficulties you might have faced?
Yeah, I think I probably should have checked with Brian on this question maybe, but I know
just high level, yeah.
Or the Akala team has done a lot of work on kind of just open source libraries. I know the ORML library is what Brian has worked on quite a bit. As far as tooling specific to XCM, one thing that I meant to mention in the last section that's kind of related to this, it's not necessarily tooling. It's kind of more in the realm of governance, which I think is also kind of related to tooling. one thing that we realized lately and we're thinking about and would like other teams on the call and not on the call to start thinking about is when you're dealing with your chain's on-chain governance, anything that happens outside of your chain, outside of your jurisdiction, there's nothing you can do. So one thing that we've realized is a need within the Polkadot ecosystem is similar to in the real world. We have international trade agreements, we have international crime agreements. We need cross-chain governance agreements between parachains and someday between anyone using any bridge. Because when things happen on your chain, you need to be able to work with the governance bodies of other chains outside of yours where there may have been some sort of interaction. So one thing the Akala team is starting to think through on the governance side is like, what does cross-chain governance agreements between entire parachains look like? And this is definitely something going forward as we see so many things happen in the crypto ecosystem as far as just incidents that happen. We need to plan ahead for when things happen and how we work together between different parachain governance bodies to deal with certain situations. So very interesting problem. It's a pretty big thing to tackle, but definitely something that I think we'll see get some legs going in the Polkadot ecosystem here pretty soon.
And I just want to touch on also, like, I think one of the things that made it from Akala into the main Polkadot repo was XCM Simulator, which was built by one of your developers, which is a way to do unit testing for XCM. And I think also, maybe we could talk to the other people here. Like, I know a lot of people in the space use X tokens, which is one of those palettes in the ORML, which is like a very specific wrapper around using XCM for token transfers. Yeah, does anyone else want to speak about the tools or technologies they've built or they're using?
I mean, I can briefly jump in. I mean, as XCM is quite important for us. I know that's we have been trying to we use X tokens, and I know that the team has been contributing back to our ORML and for the asset registry of how you basically represent other assets from the parachains easier and how to better handle them. And again, I think this is also I think a call to action to get everybody to use the ORML libraries, because it makes things much easier if we all contribute to that. And in terms of tooling, I mean, we haven't built specific tooling around that yet, but definitely something that could be quite interesting is, Sean, you already touched upon how making it easier to use XCM. I mean, right now it is quite difficult. And I don't think if you're not an engineer, it's not really easy to use right now. And for things like deploying capital onto the parachains and making function calls there, that requires quite a bit of effort. I mean, if you know what you're doing, it's actually very straightforward. But the process of getting there, I think, is something which we hope at some point to basically share the code that we have built and make it easier for people to reuse. The question is obviously, what's the best way of doing that? And I think over the next months, we'll see more and more code being reshared, specifically for these cross-chain calls and standards that are being developed. So less, to be fair, something that we've done right now, but something that we're definitely looking to do in the near future.
Definitely. Kenny, do you want to speak?
Yeah, just something to add on to kind of bridge together for, XCM, what Alexei and Lucas have talked about. So in terms of difficulty with XCM, yeah, and so just to directly answer your question, Sean, one of the things that we've done is we've built out our own sort of little internal libraries that we're still tweaking. But the idea here is that once we really do want to start opening up all the channels, then we can go do so in a much more cookie cutter manner. Because right now it does require quite a bit of hands-on development, because the channel requires both ends to open. And I guess the other thing is depending on which way the future of XCM what it looks like, right? I do like Lucas's idea of it being a lot more open, right? Rather than kind of having to manually trigger it on both ends each time. And so if that's the case, right? I mean, the library effort was quite redundant in that sense. But yeah, right now we do have some internal libraries for that.
Awesome. Yeah, I guess I would want to touch on a few other technologies or things that I think are ideation / starting to get developed. One of the things I'd like to see in XCM is, actually using it more as a standard rather than just interoperability play. So one of the things I touched on in a post on the forum was actually how XCM can be used to make wallets which work across all chains. So all of you have the ability to design and develop your own parachain with your own token systems, with multiple different tokens, multiple different kinds of palettes which back that, even other meta protocols or things like that. One of the things that we obviously want in the ecosystem is really powerful wallets, like Lucas was mentioning, that make it feel like, oh, I have just one account, not 10, 20 different accounts across different chains. And one of the ways we can actually use XCM, the meta language, to achieve this is by using XCM itself as a way for wallets to talk to the chain. So rather than saying, a wallet says, hey, look up this palette, this storage to find the balance of a user, I can actually use XCM and say, hey, query the balance of token X, right? And the XCM can convert and turn all of that, general query into a specific query for the chain. And so even as the chain upgrades and changes, that XCM query stays valid over time. So that's one of the things that I would really like to see, and I think hasn't been touched on yet a lot yet, and something I think that will be developed soon. Beyond that, I think the other thing that's really interesting it's more of a conversation right now, but I think is basically one team away from just implementing something is XCM dialects. So this is the idea around having basically extending the XCM format to cover things that you want to cover, right? So right now, as you might see, if you look at the actual XCM specification, there's a bunch of different operations that you can call which are built into the XCM specification. Now these things are pretty general. I think everyone is using it. Things like token transfers, things like swaps, things like all that kind of stuff, right? But we have here 4 different teams with 4 vastly different use cases. I imagine that there might be a subset of XCM functionalities that you want to expose and use across different chains. But it's hard to add all those general features to a general specification. Like not everyone's going to, for example, have a privacy layer like Manta does, right? And so what we can expect with XCM dialects is perhaps being able to write a sub-language, which is like, I'm not going to be using XCM, but I'm using XCM privacy. And XCM privacy has a set of functionalities, which is the general layer for doing privacy-based things on parachains. And of course, it's up to different parachains to support the different dialects or basically reject the message they don't understand. These are both things that I think are going to be really powerful in the future and things that I would like to see in terms of development in this space. I don't know if anyone has any comments on those ideas.
Yes, can you actually get that to scale though? Like if a wallet interacts with XCM, doesn't that? I guess that would be my concern with going a bit too much into detail. But
sure, if
you use XCM for like actual stuff that you can do off chain, then probably you're gonna hit some limits. I do think though that like the one, and I actually did a whole I think I did an entire Polkadot Decoded talk around this 2-3 years ago. That like the secret sauce of Ethereum is the ERC20 token.
Mm-hmm.
Like as much like EVM is sure a huge and like one state machine is a huge benefit, but the fact that you can actually do so much with it is that you have a single standard that is able to cover pretty much all of DeFi. And so I agree with you. Like the one thing we need to do is equally like standardize as much as we can around the token standard. That the entire ecosystem, supply chain, whatever you want to call it, is actually able to integrate with. So like anything from an exchange to a wallet to a custodian to like an analytics to testing, right? Testing infrastructure to reporting to this goes like from right, like there's so many things that touch ERC20 tokens in Ethereum that like the better we can actually agree on how that should happen within XCM and within parachains, the easier it will be to kind of offer all this tooling as well. And so that is my I think one thing that I think is really critical for this technology to get traction and kind of widespread adoption.
Yeah, and I would want to touch on that to say that I think I was doing substrate development for a while before XCM was even like it was always talked about, but before it was designed. And in my brain at the time, like when you talk about standards, came to like, hey, let's make one palette that everyone uses, which has a token standard, right? And I think that is actually the wrong approach. I think that is the naive approach and what I would push against. I think what I'm trying to push forward, especially what XCM unlocks, is that we can obfuscate what is actually happening in the background. We can obfuscate what exact palette you're using, what exact features and functionality a token might have, whether it can be lockable or frozen or it can be minted or whatever, that kind of stuff. And instead just expose the token standard through XCM. When I query about a token, the standard that I want to see is what the query result that XCM will provide me about that token. And it may not have, for example, every functionality about a privacy layer or it being, on another chain or it being, fungible, non-fungible. It might not have every single detail about it under the cover, but it has enough for it to be something that anyone can understand and use and interoperate with. And so these are the kinds of things where, I think XCM is still very, very new to that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of ways that we can expect to get to these standards is through things like dialects. I would love, for example, for a team with a really strong chain, token economy, to propose a token dialect, right? And then see how people adopt it. And if it gets used a lot, and a lot of people make that a standard, then maybe it can actually get rolled into XCM as the main protocol. I don't know if that resonates with anyone, but that's at least my high-level idea. But I think in the end, you're absolutely right. Standards is an important way for us to simplify the complexity of these problems. I think there's a lot of room we have to go in terms of making more standards in the Polkadot ecosystem. I think that basically engaging the community and having conversations like these is going to be a great way to do that.
Maybe to jump, I guess, that sounds really interesting, but it kind of does, again, as you said, and then it burns down to it is still then a standard that is just enforced by this dialect, and it's just that's how we use XCM, and we will be implementing that on our chain. So probably you will have a palette or a library that everybody then integrates to make, and then basically has this native conversion. So let's say it's just like working with an API. You have a standardized API, right? And then you just need to make sure that whatever data you have just kind of is compatible, and you basically parse that, and you omit anything that, as you said, whether it's I don't know if it's whether there's some private balances or not. I don't care, right? If it's not visible in other chains, if the Interlay chain cannot parse that, then we will not be able to use it anyway. So I think it does burn down to having one palette or one library. And I think, what we've seen at the very early days, when we started building Interlay, is that we had balances and X tokens, and we have still quite a few teams have both, right? So quite a few teams have balances for their main asset and then X tokens or something in that direction to import other assets. And we went we just use X tokens, for example, which caused a bit of initial pain because Ledger would initially only add balances, right? So we had to get them to see, look, you need X tokens anyway. And also Explorers didn't kind of have that support. Everybody was just using balances. And it didn't work with Polkadot.js initially, and we kind of went through this process of, okay, well, we kind of need to get that support done. But now with XCM coming and people starting to use XCM, you see that, okay, well, I want to talk to these other chains, and I can either implement my own thing or I'll just use X tokens and then asset registry and these kind of things. So I think it will converge, of course, having more comms, and now that we have a forum and we can actually track standards and maybe have a good list of we have Substrate Marketplace and where these things can be made available to new teams. So when you're building a new parachain and you see 9 out of 10 parachains are using this palette to interact, okay, maybe you use this one because then you'll get most support, most input, and you'll be able to just use existing tooling rather than building your own thing. Because in the end, if you're very honest, in terms of time to market, this saves a lot of time, and this might be valuable for a new project to succeed or actually miss the deadline and fail.
Yeah. Okay. So quickly, I think we have to wrap up soon. Why don't we each go around and just say one wish that they would make, a magic wand? You could have one thing, either built or solved or fixed in this ecosystem. What would it be? Hopefully around XCM, and then we can end it there. Maybe start with Lucas.
I think one of the big challenges of XCM today is that you need to swap all these tokens. And I think there's not a good way yet to actually do this uniformly in every chain and get tokens from another parachain. And I think if we manage to get to a point where balances and these kind of tokens are just abstracted away from users, then actually is when people can use XCM for exciting stuff, which isn't just about moving tokens, but actually doing stuff like Dan said, right? Staking, creating L dot from dot by actually doing a staking transaction through XCM. And so that's really the building block that I'm looking towards, hopefully getting built soon.
Yeah. How about you, Dan? What's your magic wand wish? One wish.
Yeah, I talked to Brian about this. I think there was a conversation that he and Gav have been talking about for a while around this interchain. I can paste the link in here, but an interchain proof Oracle network where basically all the parachains can read each other's state via XCM and like basically subscribing to this Oracle feed. Let me paste this here, but this was, I'll keep it quick, but this was Brian's kind of one of his biggest wish list items.
Awesome. Alexi?
That's tricky because you have bring your own, like mine was going to be bring your own fees on your parachain, but Lucas kind of mentioned that. So I'm going to say, make it much easier for us to talk to non-parachain substrate chains and kind of enable this as a product more, because this is where like big players are switching to Cosmos. And we see this like DYDX switching to Cosmos and being able to talk to Cosmos chains. It's not that they will be super active in an ecosystem, but it drives a lot of business, like custodians, wallets that already have a big user base of theirs using DYDX, they follow. And having this basically a substrate standalone chain as a product requires this chain then to be able to easily talk to the parachains. I know it's coming, but that's my biggest wish list. If we had this now, I think we could probably get much more projects just to start their own thing and then connect to the ecosystem. So basically kind of do this two-step approach.
Yeah, awesome. And Kenny, your one wish?
I think the most like aligned one with the whole value proposition of XCM is more so like open by default. And that's because, right, like XCM is such a powerful value proposition for the entire Polkadot and Kusama ecosystems. And I think to Lucas's point earlier, right, like when you think analogously to like decentralized applications, they don't have to think about the business development side, the partnership side, in order to start like leveraging other assets from other I guess dApps, right? And us, we're definitely at a parachain level, so it is slightly different. But I do think that like being able to commit to that sort of open by default nature would be very helpful for teams, because again, you don't have to commit as many resources. You don't have to worry about the use cases and the business development and the partnerships and just like more of the human element, and you can just start experimenting in that sandbox environment, even on like the Rococo side. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming on this panel. I want to tell everyone in the audience that this is not the end of the conversation, but actually just the beginning. The call to action here is like, if you want to continue this conversation, go to the forum. There's a whole tag called XCM. I'll post a link to the chat. And there you can see a bunch of conversations that exist currently around XCM, things like a lot of the things we've been talking about today, that you can also join the conversation. Or if there's any topics that aren't being covered, you can of course make a new topic and really engage with the community. Again, thank you everyone for joining. And yeah, Kevin, I'll let you lead us out.
Thank you so much, Sean. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining. What a phenomenal panel. And it's great to hear not just about the current state of XCM, but what we'd all like to see in the future. So a look ahead.